Claire had gotten used to being tired. Not the kind of tired that a good night's sleep could fix, but the kind that just settled into your bones and stayed there. The kind where even sitting down for a few minutes felt like a risk, because you knew if you got too comfortable, you wouldn't get back up. Most nights, she didn't have a choice. She worked late shifts at a small medical facility about 20 minutes from home. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and right now, that was all that mattered. Ever since Ethan's father left, it had just been the two of them, and everything fell on her. Rent, food, school, bills, and Ethan. Ethan was 6. Quiet, for his age. Not shy exactly, just observant. The kind of kid who noticed things most people didn't. He didn't talk much about school, didn't have many friends, but he never complained either. Most of the time, he just drew. Claire would find his drawings scattered around the apartment, on the kitchen table, the couch, sometimes even on the floor near his bed. Crayons, colored pencils, whatever he could get his hands on. At first, it was normal kid stuff. Houses, stick figures, the sun in the corner of the page. But over time, the drawings became different. More detailed. More focused. Sometimes, he would draw the same thing over and over again. Claire noticed it, but she never really had time to think about it. Most evenings followed the same routine. She'd get home just before sunset, already thinking about how little time she had before she had to leave again. Dinner was usually something quick, something easy. Frozen meals, takeout if she could afford it, or just something thrown together in a hurry. Ethan would sit at the table quietly, eating without much conversation, occasionally glancing up at her like he wanted to say something, but didn't. And Claire always noticed that. But there was always something else on her mind. The clock. She was always watching the clock. After dinner, she'd clean up as fast as she could, check Ethan's homework, and try to squeeze in a few minutes of normalcy. Sometimes she'd sit with him while he drew, asking him what he was working on. Most of the time, he'd just shrug. Just stuff, he'd say. Then came bedtime. And that was always the hardest part. Because no matter how many nights it happened, it never got easier walking out of that room knowing she wouldn't be there when he woke up. She'd sit on the edge of his bed, reading him a short story, her voice softer than usual, trying to stretch the moment just a little longer. Ethan would listen quietly, holding onto the blanket, his eyes half focused on her. Sometimes, he'd ask simple questions. Are you working again tonight? And Claire would always give the same answer. Just for a little while. Even though they both knew it wasn't true. When the story ended, she'd tuck him in, brush his hair back gently, and tell him she loved him. Then she'd turn off the light. And leave. That night started the same as any other. Claire got home late, more exhausted than usual. Her shift the night before had run longer than expected, and she'd barely gotten any sleep. Still, she pushed through the routine. Dinner. Clean up. Homework. Ethan barely spoke. She noticed that too. By the time bedtime came around, she could feel that familiar weight in her chest again. That quiet guilt that never really went away. She read him a story, something short, something he'd heard before. He didn't react much. Just lay there, listening. When she finished, she stood up slowly, adjusting the blanket around him. I'll be back in the morning, she said. Ethan didn't answer right away. He just looked at her. Then gave a small nod. Claire turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, pulling the door almost closed behind her. She had just started walking toward the kitchen when she heard it. A voice. Soft. At first, she thought it was the TV. Maybe she had left it on earlier. But then she stopped. Listened. It was coming from Ethan's room. She moved closer to the door, her hand resting lightly against it. And then she heard it again. Whispering. Quiet. Low. Like someone having a conversation. Her stomach tightened slightly. For a second, she just stood there, trying to make sense of it. Then she pushed the door open. Ethan? The room was dark, except for a faint glow from the streetlight outside. Ethan was in bed. Alone. He turned his head toward her slowly. Who were you talking to? She asked. Her voice was calm, but there was something behind it now. Something more alert. Ethan blinked. Talking? Claire stepped a little further into the room, scanning it without making it obvious. Closet door closed. Window shut. Nothing out of place. I heard you, she said. Just now. Ethan sat up slightly, the blanket falling into his lap. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he looked at her, like he was deciding whether or not to explain something. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. He said someone's gonna stay with me. Claire frowned slightly. What do you mean? Ethan hesitated, then said, when you're gone. There was a brief silence. Claire let out a small breath, shaking her head just a little. Ethan, you were probably dreaming. He didn't respond, just kept looking at her. Something about the way he said it, the way he didn't argue, didn't insist, just made it sit wrong for a second. But Claire pushed that feeling down. She was tired. That's all it was. Kids imagine things. That was normal. Get some sleep, she said gently. She pulled the blanket back over him, waited a second longer than usual, then turned off the light again. As she stepped out into the hallway, she paused for just a moment. Listening. Nothing. The apartment was quiet again. Claire closed the door and walked away. By the time she grabbed her keys and left for work, she had already convinced herself it didn't mean anything.